birds are literally dinosaurs. So in the same way that we are mammals, we have mammalian ancestors and we evolved from mammals, we are mammals. Birds evolved from dinosaurs. They are literally dinosaurs. It's that simple, but people who don't know that find it somewhere between odd and disconcerting and unbelievable, but it simply is the case. And the evidence for that transition is as overwhelming, if not more so, than the meteor extinction.
Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This episode is with David Hone. Dr. Hone is a paleontologist and a writer. His research focuses on the behavior and ecology of the dinosaurs and their flying relatives, the pterosaurs. He is the author of Tyrannosaurs Chronicles and the Future of Dinosaurs. Here we talk about importance of fossils in science, process of fossilization, why did dinosaurs go extinct, evolution of modern birds, and the future of dinosaurs. Enjoy the conversation, share and subscribe to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, so as a scientist who's working on dinosaurs, I mean, these dinosaurs are the creatures probably which don't exist. I mean, they don't exist, but they are probably the ones which are most talked about in the recent times. Right?
I mean, by far, it's one quirk of my job is that everyone goes, oh, paleontologists, oh, you study dinosaurs. And it's like, well, no, the vast majority of paleontologists have nothing to do with dinosaurs. But as it happens, I do study dinosaurs, so you're right, for entirely the wrong reason. But yeah, I think paleontology is just synonymous with dinosaurs. And as I say, I kind of wish it wasn't. It's particularly unfair on large banks of my colleagues who, work on fossil fungi or fish or plants or bacteria even, and they get lumped in with me. That's definitely unfair on them.
I mean, indeed, basically, we'll talk about that, why it is synonymous to the work on dinosaurs. But let's start with your background a little bit, that how, or a scientist who is working on dinosaurs, how, or what do that scientists do in general in daily life?
I mean, in daily life, what I mostly do is teach and administration. So my job at the university is primarily a teaching one, not a research one. So my research is largely crammed into evenings and weekends and holidays, as indeed, frankly, is a lot of my outreach. So, my books I've written have been written basically in weekends and vacations. So this is all done on top of my daily job. And yeah, in that regard, I'm not different to almost any other academic, and increasing numbers of us with less and less research time. So yeah, I'm either preparing classes or giving classes or meeting students or marking essays or sitting on various, panels and what's the word I'm looking for? Committees and chairing meetings and all the rest of the, I was going to say rubbish, but the stuff that goes on with trying to run a modern university. And I think the average member of the public would be shocked at how little time even our inverted commas research focused academics actually spend doing research. I think people don't appreciate that this isn't the era of Darwin and even the 1930s and 1940s where academics sat in their office twiddling their thumbs staring at the ceiling thinking, and if they saw a student that week, well, that was quite good, and they might give a class when they feel like it. That hasn't been a thing for 50 70 years.
Yeah, I mean, in general, when I talk to other colleagues or other scientists, this is what I at least mention in my conversations, that research or academia is difficult. I mean, we shouldn't kind of show or pose that it's okay, it's nothing, but it is a difficult job, so that at least people who decide to enter in academia, they can kind of consciously decide whether they want to do this or they want to do probably something else.
Yeah, it's just a whole field where it's just not how people perceive it. And of course, I'm sure there's a lot of jobs which are not really like people think they are. But I think academia has this, ivory towers, gowns, academics just sitting around doing research, and the students are tolerated. And it's exactly the opposite, is that, teaching is 90 plus, or the, and all the associated stuff we're teaching is often 90% plus of the job now. It's not like it was a century ago, or say even probably 50 years ago, and therefore hasn't been for a long time.
And one of the reasons being that just the science is advancing so fast, and we need to basically put this information out there and probably design more courses, educate people, right?
Well, I think in the UK and to a lesser extent in the US, but they're in the same kind of boat. It's become a money thing, to be blunt. You know, the governments have stopped giving us the cash that they used to and said, make your own money. And the only product we have is teaching, and therefore the number of students rockets. And that takes a lot more time than it used to. And the equation is that simple. You know, if you need to make, you know, an extra £100,000, that's another 10 students. And if the university says it needs an extra £20 million a year to function, well, that's another, you know, to 20,000 students. And that's a lot of people that we need to accommodate. And that's really how it goes.
Yeah, but I mean, definitely in these cases, public can participate as well. I mean, we'll discuss about those ways in probably later. But let's now get into the topic about dinosaurs. So let's start with the fossils itself. Like, what is the importance of fossils when it comes to our understanding of evolution in general, the nature that we see on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, they're basically critical. I mean, you know, the planets are, you know, I don't know my numbers very well because it's just so far out of my knowledge, but like the Earth's like 4.2 billion years old, give or take, something like that. And life's been around for maybe 3.5 billion, but certainly 3 billion. We've got a decent fossil record. So we've had 3 billion years of life on Earth, and science has kind of been a formal way of studying life, and we've had a good understanding of life and, you know, in paleontology for maybe 200 years. So if you want to understand the history of life on planet, the last 200 years of study are not the best place to start. The previous 3 billion are probably going to tell you a bit more, and the only way you can access that is the fossil record. And so yeah, any kind of long-term plan, you know, we have, you know, humans have witnessed and documented species arriving, species splitting, species going extinct, but that's still rare. And we're still looking at things on a very small scale and a very short term. And so if you want to do anything over more than 100 years, and frankly, almost anything more than about 10 years, which is about the limit you can realistically keep most studies going, the only possible way you can do that is to look to fossils. So while I think a lot of biologists think that paleontology is kind of like this odd little offshoot of biology, I think it should be absolutely integral. And ironically, I don't really say that as a paleontologist because I started as a biologist. So I am someone who, I did an undergraduate degree in zoology. My specialization was animal behavior. I moved into taxonomy and systematics and identifying species and clades and lineages. And from that, I ended up in paleontology almost by accident. And so I have, I think, a decent spread. I have a degree in both. I have backgrounds in both fields. And it's frightening how little biologists know and understand anything of the fossil record and the data that's available and what can fill in gaps and teach them things that they don't understand. And the flip side is it's often frightening for me how little biology paleontologists know, because in the UK, at least, it's a branch of earth sciences, which means it's a branch of geology. And therefore, a lot of paleontologists have a geology degree, which contains very little biology at all that isn't paleontology and therefore is already focused on the fossil record. And so we've almost got one field which should entirely be unified, and it's split into two discrete camps, neither of whom talk to the other, which seems like a bad choice as far as I'm concerned. And so, yeah, I think it's a genuine problem, and it's improving slowly, but I long for the day that biology degrees have a fairly major paleontological component to them, because I think it will massively improve the field of biology. But that day is quite a long way from coming. And ironically, you know, I teach in a biology department. I am the token paleontologist, and that in itself is unusual. But I don't teach any paleontology classes because I don't have anyone to teach them with me. And there's other classes that need teaching, and that's what I'm paid to do. And so even when you've got a paleontologist established in a biology department with a biology degree, I'm not teaching much at all about this subject. And so it still doesn't happen. And I think that's very common. I think, in the UK at least, and I think, to be honest, almost everywhere I've been and talking to friends and colleagues, I can't think of many, if any, biology departments that have, a major part, not like half, but, like 10% of their component is teaching this subject. I just don't think it happens.
Yeah, but I think that this shift will happen because, if public can get excited about the field from movies, I think they can get excited about the field from real life examples as well, that how much we are learning and how much information is there. Right?
Yeah, there's always that hope, but then, dinosaurs have always been popular. Michael Crichton, I've read an interview with him after Jurassic Park, the film came out, which is only a couple of years after the book. And he said he'd had the idea for the book like 10 years earlier, like in the early or mid 80s. And he said he was waiting. Dinosaurs were in the media all the time, and there's always new kids dinosaur books, and there's always new museum exhibits. And he's like, I don't want to be seen as being like a bandwagon guy who's just like jumping on the dinosaur bandwagon. So I'm going to wait till all the dinosaur stuff dies down, and then I'll do Jurassic Park. And of course, what he said was that never happened. Dinosaurs were always in the media, and there was always a new dinosaur exhibition, and there was always a dinosaur kids show or documentary on TV, because dinosaurs were just popular all the time. And so that's been true since at least the 80s. And here we are in 2020, so 2022, so at least 35 years, arguably 40, and we haven't seen that shift yet. So I hope you're right and it's coming, but I'm not sure the popularity of dinosaurs is driving university courses, because if it was, we'd have had it by now, and we haven't at all. And here we are, the 6th Jurassic Park film is out in this week at the time of recording. So that hasn't done it. So I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, but the fact that a biologist is talking to a paleontologist, so I think that shift is happening.
Well, yeah, we can make a dent. But yeah, to anyone who's listening, please beg your biology department for paleontology courses. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, and before you mentioned that about the sample itself, and when it comes to paleontologies and fossils. Let's talk about the process of fossilization. Of course, once you think of fossils, it's like, these dead creatures, etc.
Yeah.
You're just looking at the bones and stuff, but there is a lot going on there, and it's not like anything that dies turns into a fossil, right?
No, that's very true. I'll say in advance, you're almost immediately getting outside of my comfort zone, because ironically, I am a biologist, and therefore actually I never did the standard courses on things like geological ages and dating and the fossilization process and the rock record, because I didn't do a geology degree. But the long and short of it is, the vast majority of animals and indeed plants, I tend to say animals when I'm talking about fossils, it's what I work on, but of course it's plants and bacteria and algae and fungi and leaves and flowers and footprints and all the rest of it. The vast majority of these things never enter the fossil record. The fossil record is simultaneously brilliant and terrible. It's amazing how many things we do have in the fossil record, things you'd think would never preserve, like jellyfish, and nests of eggs and footprints and tracks of animals swimming and fighting and all this stuff actually turn up occasionally. But on the flip side of that, very, very, very few animals will ever be buried and preserved. And that's ultimately what needs to happen. A fossil is essentially some kind of biological thing, whether that be a footprint or an egg, so kind of evidence of an animal's movements or activities, or what people usually think of, bones, shells, teeth, tree trunks and things like this, are an actual biological feature that has become preserved. And ultimately, fossilization is the process of lithification. It has turned to stone in some way, shape or form. And in order for that to happen, of course, something has to be buried. So you've immediately got, an animal dies, or plant dies, for whatever reason that is. And then what happens to most of them, of course, is that they fall apart. Scavengers eat them, fungi break them down, flies and beetles and things get to them, wind, rain, washing down a stream, they all break up into bits. There is essentially nothing left. And so the first thing that has to happen is that has to be buried or in some way, shape or form removed from availability of detritivores and things that would break it down from having access to it. And usually that's just being buried in sand or soil or mud or in a riverbed or something like that. We get weird ones like volcanic ash turns up occasionally from volcanic eruptions. And certain beds, you can have water where it's incredibly anoxic or toxic. So there's no oxygen, or there's very, very high dissolved methane levels, or it's very acidic or something like this, which just stops bacteria and other things living, and therefore they can't break it down. But basically, sooner or later, something needs to be buried, kept free of anything that could destroy it, and so that it doesn't decay. And then if it's buried in enough stuff and left for long enough, a mineralization process occurs that effectively turns it to stone. And then that's what we're finding. But of course, it's rare that things die and are not destroyed. It's further rare that they're then buried. They've then got to be buried under enough stuff that they actually have sufficient time and pressure to become a fossil. And then we got to find them. If that's at the bottom of the ocean, or if that's at the bottom of a mountain, we're never going to find it again. Well, the planet's constantly moving, tectonic activity. We actually need it to rise up and be eroded by wind, rain, rivers or whatever to expose those fossils. And so you add up these unlikelihoods. It's unlikely it'll be buried. It'll unlikely it won't be scavenged. It'll unlikely that it will ultimately turn to fossil. It'll be unlikely that it's available on the surface. It's unlikely that we'll find it. And fossils are very, 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 very rare things indeed compared to the actual original living organisms. With a few weird exceptions. So things like chalk cliffs, so, the White Cliffs of Dover, whole of southeast England, these beautiful white cliffs, they're made up of coccolithophores. They're tiny little seashells. Trillions and trillions and trillions of them, because seashells don't break down and nothing eats them. And so if you leave them long enough, the levels will build up, and that's effectively what they are. So those we have more than we know what to do with for, billions of years of science, because there's only so much you can do with them. And T-Rexes, we've got about 20. And lots of dinosaurs are known from single specimens, most of which are badly incomplete. I've named several species off like half a jaw. They're enough to tell that they're genuinely different and new, so they get a name, but not a lot of them. And that's the contrast, and that's the bizarre kind of contradictions of the fossil record. They're extraordinarily rare, except for when they're extraordinarily common.
That's, I think, fascinating summary of the process. It's exciting to, even know that something like this exists. Like they can be even fossils and stuff like that. And what about the time duration? If this happens, like how long this process could be?
So I think it's generally understood that anything less than like about 1 million years old isn't really a fossil. So it is a process, fossilization. So there are things that we call sub-fossils, because they're not quite original organic bone or shell, but they also haven't fully translated into rock, depending on how long they were under before they were exposed again or discovered. But generally, you've got, things like dodos and mammoths. These are not fossils. They're extinct organisms, but their bones are still organic. You can get DNA out of them and stuff like this. And then you've got sub-fossils of stuff that's, might be 500,000 years old, where was starting to go, and if it had been left longer, probably would. And then you've kind of got true fossils, which are, and in theory, at least, the realm of paleontologists are true fossils. But in practice, few biologists work on anything that is extinct. And so people who are working on, mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers, which in some cases are like 5,000 years old, very, very recently lived into modern times, are documented in, not just things like stone tablets, but even paper. But they're long extinct, and no one's really working on them unless you have an understanding of a lot of the geological processes of burial and how to interpret how you find these things and how things like rivers can move them and distort our understanding. That's kind of the realm of paleontologists. And so technically paleontologists work on fossils. Practically, if something's been extinct for more than about 100 years, it's usually the realm of paleontologists rather than biologists. Though, again, there are some exceptions and people who kind of straddle those lines, particularly when it's something that's got a lot of recent relatives. So, there's a colleague of mine who works on extinct storks and herons, for example, but there's a lot of living storks and herons. So she works on both. But in some ways you'd call her a paleontologist, in other ways you call her a biologist. It kind of depends what group she's working on. But there's not too many of those kinds of people out there.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, of course, it may happen that in a few decades we hear another field called paleobiologist or something.
Well, so paleobiology is used as a term, but it's usually applied to people like me who are more interested in extinct animals as living animals. So I look at things like dinosaur behavior and dinosaur ecology. I'm not that interested in their evolution or where you find them or how they got buried or those processes. So yeah, we do talk about paleobiology, but it's more kind of like, dinosaurs and indeed other fossil organisms as living organisms. But yeah, it's ultimately, again, going back to what I said earlier, that's where I'd like to see things going. I'd like this to be a much more integrative field.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so the other thing that you mentioned, that these fossils, they literally turned into a rock. I mean, that's basically the difference between subfossils and fossils.
Effectively, yeah. So fossils are lithified organic remains or organic activity. So when you find any rock, it is something that used to be soil or a lava flow or a sand dune or whatever it was, and compression deep underground and huge amounts of time and heat have turned it into a rock. Its chemical composition might have changed, or its structure might have changed. And what's happening, with bones in rocks is that they are leaching in chemicals from the stuff that buries them, and it will undergo a chemical change because it's chemical reactions happen with heat and time and temperature, and often water as well going on. That's what you'd expect. So, bones themselves as living tissues are actually quite wet and gooey and flexible. When they dry out, which is how most people will encounter them, if you have a skull on the wall and a set of horns in your house or something like that, with giving it to the dog, they're often dried bone, and they've lost, cartilage and a whole bunch of other things that would make them slightly soft and gooey. But then that again will change and transform underground, and that's partly why fossils can look so very different. I've pulled white fossils out of sand beds in Mongolia, which are as white and look like they died yesterday, and then there's jet black stuff coming out of oil shales where they basically got oil in them, and everything in between. So yeah, but they are rocks, and that actually leads to all kinds of different problems, because there are certain rocks out there, for example, which decay in the presence of air. So we dig them up and leave them on a shelf, and then they just crumble to dust. Wow. So we have to keep them, actually air is less of a problem. It's usually humidity, but we have to keep them in super dry environments and, aircon special spaces, because otherwise they'll just disintegrate, and they can often collapse under their own weight. So very fragile bones, bone has one type of structure and rock has another. And it's almost like, you can build a suspension bridge out of metal, but if you kind of magically waved a magic wand and turned it to stone, it would disintegrate. It's good at holding up its own structure in one material, but it doesn't work in a different one. And this is what's happened. It's gone from bone, which is one material, to rock, which is a different one. And so many bones, we leave them in the rock and use the rock as a support, and only expose bits of them, and then rely on scans or other specimens to kind of fill our gaps in. It's not as simple as you can just pull a skeleton out of the ground. On rare occasions, it is that simple, but they're very, very rare.
Yeah, and that makes basically your job more difficult.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like it's always difficult. I know it sounds slightly trivial, but it's a genuine issue. There is no such thing as a complete fossil. Even skeletons where we go, oh, we've got a complete skeleton. What we usually mean is except for a few bits. The end of the tail is missing. We haven't got one hand, but we've got the right hand. We haven't got the left one, so we know what it looked like. But it's still only a skeleton. We haven't got the muscles. We haven't got the skin. We haven't got the heart, lungs, liver, digestive system. We haven't got any DNA. We haven't got brain or any of its neurology. So yeah, a complete skeleton is extraordinarily valuable for the work that I do, but it's still a fraction of the organism, let alone the variation within the population, let alone the history of the population over its 2-3 million years that it was around, let alone the environment that was in, what was eating it, what parasites did it have, what diseases did it, all of these are just enormous gaps that we're lucky if we can fill in even the edges of them in a few cases.
I see. I think this is already now people can get an idea how vast the field is, and it's with all the different species that we see around us, and it's going like it's expanding to another level now, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's staggering how little we know about most living species. A point I like making is it's in some ways staggering how little we know about humans. We have studied humans ourselves obviously more intensely than probably the rest of the animal world combined. The entire field of medicine, veterinary science barely exists compared to medicine, and vets, cows, sheep, pigs, dogs, cats, hamsters, donkeys, horses, chickens, ducks, and all the rest of it. And we're just doing us. There's an awful lot more doctors than there are vets, and we've been doing it for a lot longer. And there's a lot more people to study. And yet there are hundreds, if not thousands of medical journals constantly publishing new papers explaining, we've seen this odd new disease, we've seen this odd new response to this disease, we found this odd gene that's doing something, we found a person whose physiology allows them to do that. It's an unending supply, and that's after centuries of study of one species. So yeah, when my entire knowledge of my dinosaur species is half a jaw, guess what? There's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, since you already mentioned dinosaurs, let's bring them also in the discussion. So let's start with this. When like people first time saw these kind of fossils, coming out, and because they didn't know that something like this exists, and now, of course, we know a lot more about them. How did they kind of dealt with this information that, okay, this should be a new species which existed at some point in the past, etc.?
Yeah, so it's an interesting and complex history, though, of course, it's mostly relatively recent. So there's various ideas floating around that there were dinosaur skeletons knocking about, particularly in the US and Canada, and then in China, and that these are the subjects of various folklores and local legends and things like that. And I think that's mostly extremely unlikely. I'm sure the odd thing got in somewhere, but I think the problem is people see, not that I want to talk about Jurassic Park, but not just Jurassic Park, but documentaries as well. And what you usually see is a bunch of people out in the field with a complete skeleton in the hillside. That just basically doesn't happen. And people in medieval or historical times had better things to do than wander around deserts, which is where you mostly find this stuff, and see a handful of bones sticking out of a hillside and then excavate a complete skeleton to see what it was and then try and work out what it was. People just didn't do that, and skeletons just don't lie around complete articulated skeletons on the hillside because they're eroding, and so bits are coming out at a time and then they're fragmenting and decaying and falling apart. You've got to dig them up, and people weren't digging them up. So I don't think that the legend of giant thunderbirds from the native North Americans came from pterosaur fossils. I don't think that griffins came from East Asia and Protoceratops fossils and stuff like this. I'm sure the odd bit did, but these would have been a real anomaly and not something normal. And so really the field of paleontology with regard to dinosaurs, but most paleontology as a whole, starts in the late end of the 1700s. We were starting to dig up vertebrate fossils, and in Europe, France, Germany, and the UK. And then early 1800s, we started getting loads of the big marine reptiles. And in particular, we got dinosaurs like about, I think they're still dug up in the 1700s when no one what knew with them. And then we started to get some better bits that allowed you to go, okay, there's actually an animal here. It's not just a few odd bits of anomaly that we can't really work out. And I think it's no coincidence that that also coincided, particularly in the UK, but not just the UK, with the expansion of empire. And therefore you had, exotic animals coming back from all over the world. Prior to that, yes, you had Columbus in the 1400s and people before that, but, large numbers of skeletons of whether it's a bird or a kangaroo or an iguana or a crocodile or a giraffe, and all these things coming in large enough numbers that they weren't just going, straight into the king's collection, which is what used to happen when there was one. And at a time when science as a field itself was kind of formalizing, chemistry was well along at this point, physics was well along at this point. We had a kind of systematic study, but also coupled with that, the kind of, the gentleman scientist, which comes from having a bunch of rich people with lots of time on their hands. And you now, I think, had this almost kind of perfect storm of, this is pre-Darwin, but people like Darwin who had the time and money to devote their studies to whatever they wanted and had access to these exotic and unusual animals to compare the fossils to, and the fossils being dug up. And part of the reason the fossils were being dug up was, in the UK at least, lots and lots of quarrying. They're building canals, they're building railways, they're building bridges and tunnels, and they're digging up coal for the furnaces because the Industrial Revolution is starting to kick in and all of this stuff is coming through as well. So all of that had to happen, not necessarily simultaneously, but it was happening simultaneously. And so now it's, okay, we've got half a skeleton, or at least partial skeleton, of this weird animal, and we have a good understanding now of what reptiles look like in skeletons compared to mammals, compared to birds, compared to other things. This is a reptile, and it's a big one, and it doesn't match any reptile that we currently know on Earth, and it's come out of rocks which we think are pretty old. Therefore, this is some weird, giant, ancient reptile. And that's largely the pattern that was coming through. And of course, initially this stuff is extremely fragmentary. It's a bone here, it's a jaw there, but as more you dig, it's the same with paleontology even now. The more you dig, the more you're going to start finding whole skeletons, or most of skeletons, rather than bits of bone. And so as that, and as people started finding more, they started looking, and the floodgates pretty much opened. And then by the mid to late 1800s, only 50 years later, you've got vast swathes of skeletons being dug up, particularly in North America, but there's stuff coming out of East Africa, there's stuff coming out of India, stuff coming all over Europe, and and paleontology is now its own entire branch of science, and dinosaurs were a major part of those early years.
Interesting. But then where are the dinosaurs? Why did they go extinct?
Well, that was an area of great controversy for decades, but I think starting in the kind of late 80s, with the Alvarezes, so a father and son team called Alvarez, working on sites starting in Italy, and then I can't remember where, in Canada, I think, but basically they worked out that there'd probably been a meteor strike, and then ultimately we tracked down this crater to the east coast of northern Mexico. And now the data is, overwhelming, that basically at the very end of the Cretaceous, about 65.5 million years ago, a tanking great rock, something about the size of Mount Everest, I've heard, or something about the size of Long Island, New York. So a big bit of rock traveling at something like about 10 times the speed of sound, which is very, very, very fast indeed. A fast, machine gun bullet is about 2 to 3 times. So 3 times that speed. Basically hit the Earth and atomized and effectively caused a nuclear winter. It's just driving so much dust and ash into the atmosphere that it blocks the sun out for a significant period of time. That takes a couple of years to clear, possibly a decade. Very little sunlight. It's cold. So it's cold, it's dark, all the plants die. Once you've killed all the plants, everything else is kind of doomed. And so, yeah, huge amounts of life died off, in particular large things, and dinosaurs were mostly large. And so the dinosaurs went, pterosaurs went, marine reptiles went, lots of other things, even stuff that survived. So, mammals survived, birds survived. They took a real kicking. Birds went from something like, 20 lineages down to about 3. So, it really was devastating, even to those groups that, inverted commas, escaped. But life is pretty resilient. Enough things clung on in enough places, and then you've got basically a world free of large predators and large competitors, and things diversified, and here we are. that's the very short version of human evolution in 2.5 minutes.
But how strong the evidence is now for the asteroid hitting Earth?
Basically overwhelming. So the main thing is we have the crater. So we have an enormous hole in the ground, dated to exactly the right time. That's really quite overwhelming in itself. But the stuff that the Alvarez is working on initially was this iridium layer. So you have iridium is extraordinarily rare in the world. And it's very, very common in meteorites and asteroids. And basically, at the time of this, at the break, basically between the end of the dinosaurs and the start of, inverted commas, modern era, there's this layer of red clay almost globally, and it's full of iridium. So where has suddenly a vast amount of iridium come from? Well, probably from an asteroid. And then you find this crater in Mexico that's about the right time. That kind of links it together. And also where that you find that iridium. So that layer is very, very thick in Mexico, North America, Canada, Brazil. It's much thinner in Europe. It's thinner still in Australia and almost non-existent. So you can almost see it spreading out because, of course, the further it has to go, the less of it will travel. And so you can largely draw a line through these data points and the distance that they are from Mexico. And yeah, there's a vast amount of iridium in the area, and it gets less and less the further and further out you go, and it's exactly at the border at the time when everything goes extinct. And that really is pretty much it. The only question now is, how well were the dinosaurs doing up to that point? Because there's various other studies which have been going on suggesting that the dinosaurs were kind of already in trouble, doing okay, but doing nothing like as well as they had for the previous 140 million years that they were around. And that even if that hadn't happened, maybe they were on their way out. I'm not overly convinced by that. There's tons of papers going backwards and forwards in this that I haven't read because, frankly, I don't particularly care, and it's not really my field. And I have good friends and colleagues on both sides of the debate, so I don't particularly want to upset either of them because obviously they both think they're right. But even if dinosaurs were in trouble, it's not like they were clinging on with just 2 or 3 species left. They were doing fine. They just weren't anything like as dominant as they were before. Again, I don't know how true that is, but it's not like, had the asteroid not hit, dinosaurs would have been dead anyway and everything would have happened as it was. That's definitely not the case. But there's lots of gaps in our knowledge, again, because, and at least in part, and this is the problem, the fossil record is patchy. There are times where it's very good, there's times where it's very bad. Just before the asteroid hit, you're talking about a fairly narrow window in time. And globally, that's not represented very well. So it's hard to know quite how well dinosaurs are doing. They appear to be not doing that well in North America, but maybe they were doing absolutely spectacularly in Africa. Well, we don't know. We've basically got no rocks from that era in the whole continent. So there's just no data. So yeah, this is why we have these gaps and limited understanding.
Yeah, but interestingly, the relatives of dinosaurs, they still survived, or at least we have them at the present times, are modern birds.
Yeah, but birds are literally dinosaurs. So in the same way that we are mammals, we have mammalian ancestors and we evolved from mammals, we are mammals. Birds evolved from dinosaurs. They are literally dinosaurs. It's that simple, but people who don't know that find it somewhere between odd and disconcerting and unbelievable, but it simply is the case. And the evidence for that transition is as overwhelming, if not more so, than the meteor extinction. you can trace bird origins and evolution in extraordinary detail. And we've now got numerous feathered dinosaurs as well. And we can see things like their brain structure is similar to early birds, their pelvis structure, their vertebrae, their neck, their beak. We've looked at the genes of modern birds and shown that we actually still have some dinosaurian traits knocking around in their genes. It's all there. I mean, I would argue that alongside the origin of whales and the origin of humans, the origin of birds is one of like the three best documented major evolutionary transitions in Earth's history. Possibly you could add the origin of land animals from fish into that as well. But yeah, right up there, up the top. It is as certain as anything can reasonably be in evolutionary history, and therefore very, very certain indeed.
Yeah, I mean, simply because birds are exciting, and the flights, the colors, this different behaviors. It's
yeah, they're really cool animals. I mean, in some ways, I've argued, it's still a planet of birds. We have nearly twice as many bird species as we do mammals. They don't occupy the ecosystem as much because, we have elephants and rhinos and hippo and buffalo that weigh tons, and the largest bird weighs a few kilos. But in terms of diversity, there are huge numbers of bird species. And as you say, they're often a lot more colorful and interesting, and then they can fly compared to the average mammal, where even the bats, and I really like my bats, but there's a handful of species which are not just brown. Yeah, there's only a handful of birds which are just brown. A lot more of them are blues, pinks, greens, greys, and every other color under the sun and beyond, because of course there's a lot of UV light stuff going on in birds as well, which is very nice. So yeah, they are fundamentally extremely interesting animals. And yeah, humans have a real affection for birds. Bird watching is a thing all over the world in a way that mammal watching just isn't. And I think that speaks to their popularity.
Yeah, I mean, I do bird watching. That's why I could say that, okay, how fascinating they are. The other point would be, or why basically people have difficulty to connect birds with dinosaurs is, I mean, one thing is that we look at dinosaurs as this huge, giant animals, rather than, because there is a lot of variation there. It's not like only T-Rex, right?
Oh yeah, so I think the human angle is perhaps a good analogy again. That if you said we evolved from mammals, okay, people are quite happy with that. But then they can see, you can go to the zoo and see monkeys and gorillas, and you go, well, they look a lot like us. You can see how like us they actually are, not just in their physical appearance, but in their behavior. But if your perception of mammals wasn't primates, but was giraffes and rats and manatees, and I told you that humans evolved from them, you'd probably struggle to get it. I might be able to convince you, but you've got hair, you've got mammary glands and produce milk, you give birth to live young, you have internal fertilization. The structure of your heart is the same. It's like, well, okay, I can't really see it. But yeah, the analogy follows with the dinosaurs. Most people's perception of dinosaurs is T-Rex and Stegosaurus and Diplodocus. And it's very hard to understand how a sparrow has come from them. But again, you're looking at as you say, the disparate, more unusual and very less bird-like ones. But there's dinosaurs that are a kilogram or 250 grams in weight, with long legs and 3 toes and hollow bones and covered in feathers and a beak. Well, suddenly that looks a hell of a lot like a bird. And there's a good reason for that, because they're very close relatives to the ancestors of birds. And if you look at all of those dinosaurs, it's almost impossible not to see the similarities between birds and dinosaurs. But yeah, that only comes about because most of those fossils are very recent. The exception of Archaeopteryx, so the famous one from the mid-1800s of Germany, the vast majority of these are post-1990 and even post-2000. They're recent. They're not in kids' books for, most people my age, and I'm early 40s, people didn't get these in books when they were a kid. And therefore, half the adult population of the world, this post-dates when they stopped being interested in dinosaurs, and so don't know this stuff. And therefore, inevitably, yeah, if you show them Diplodocus and go, birds evolved from that, they'll look at me like you got 3 heads, in the same way that you would if you told them that they'd evolved from elephants. But that's not what we're saying. We're saying that elephants are part of the group that contains the ancestors of humans. And that's the same case here. Diplodocus and T-Rex and Stegosaurus and Triceratops are all part of a group we call dinosaurs. And one branch of that are extraordinarily bird-like, and indeed went on to produce birds.
Yeah, or basically that they both shared a common ancestor in the past.
Yeah,
which one kind of went on to become dinosaurs. I mean, that they evolved in dinosaurs, and the other ones are in modern birds.
Yeah, and it also speaks to people's, misunderstanding or lack of knowledge, about dinosaur diversity. Most people will name 5 or 6 species. If you really put their nose to it, maybe a dozen. If you list a few more species, they might go, oh, that sort of sounds familiar. I think that's true. There's about 1,500 species of dinosaurs. People would struggle to get to 10. There's an enormous diversity out there, and people just don't know about it. And I'm not suggesting that the public is somehow doing something wrong by not knowing there's 1,500 species. But there's an awful lot more than I think they realize and appreciate, and therefore our depth and breadth of knowledge and understanding about their evolutionary history is way beyond what they would realize.
Yeah, and one reason is the simple naming of the species itself, right? I mean, it'll be difficult for scientists to.
Oh God, I can't remember them. Yeah, I regularly get asked questions about stuff because I do lots of outreach like this podcast and articles and live sessions online, and I visit schools and stuff, and my favorite dinosaur is this. I'm like, I've never heard of it because I can't remember them all. It's too many, and they come out. We've named an average of a dinosaur a week for the last 10 years. Those numbers just rack up, and you can't remember. I can't remember half of them. I've forgotten that. I literally forgot the name of something I'd named a few years ago and had to go and look it up. It's too many. It doesn't fit in my head anymore.
Fascinating. So what you mentioned about Archaeopteryx is, I think, exciting. Let's talk a little bit about that. So because when we were talking about the process of fossilization, I mean, of course, we covered a little bit about like how bones can turn into stones. But then there is another thing that you mentioned about the prints. It can be some sort of soft
impressions of things,
impressions, etc. How does that happen?
So it can occur in a number of different ways. If you think about footprints at the side of a riverbank, for example, it's muddy because it's wet. An animal walks through, leaves some footprints. There's then a drought. It dries out. So then that mud, if anyone's walked along a dry riverbed, can become extremely hard indeed. Often following a drought, you tend to get a bit of a flood, lots of rain at the end of a period of none, lots of mud washes in and then fills in that footprint without the underlying one getting too saturated so that it breaks down in shape. That all bakes hard, dries, buried, stone, all the rest, and then ultimately you can pull a footprint out of it. What you can get with things like Archaeopteryx, which is a skeleton and feathers, is in the case of Archaeopteryx, they are mostly feather impressions. So the feathers were there on the skeleton because feathers are fairly resistant to decay. Not, there's some feather lice and things, but not a lot eats feathers. So the animal's dead, the muscles rotted away, the bacteria have got to that, but nothing's eaten the bone, nothing's eaten the feathers. It's there, it's buried in mud, and then the feathers have decayed. Now, that can be that they just broke down under the heat and water and all the rest, or it could be very slow acting bacteria eventually got to them. But either way, the feathers were basically dissolved or vanished inside out, leaving a cavity. So leaving that impression in the rock, so analogous to a footprint, where rather than the foot lifting off, the feather is just dissolved. And then when stuff washes in, it fills in that cavity. And so then we get the bones preserving as a fossil, and then we get the impressions of feathers. What we've got a lot from China in particular, and to a lesser extent from Brazil now, and there's a couple turned up in Canada, is actual preserved feathers. So the feathers haven't broken down and decayed. They've been buried themselves and have preserved, but they're really messed up when they end up as like this carbon film in the rock surface. And actually, although you've got real organic remains which have fossilized, they usually look a lot less nice than the impressions that you get for Archaeopteryx. But we can at least see that they are feathers, and occasionally you get really good ones.
Interesting. And that's also kind of one of the evidence that dinosaurs, they had feathers. And
yeah, we literally have hundreds of dinosaur fossils representing dozens of species with feathers preserved. This is no extrapolation or interpretation or trying to work out. No, there's a feather there on the skeleton. Like, it's kind of hard to argue with that. And not just like feathers randomly assigned, but longer feathers on the tips of the wings, shorter feathers inside, different kind of feathers on the body to what they have on the wings that are different lengths and different shapes and different proportions. Exactly what you see in modern birds often, and testament to the fact that different feathers are doing different jobs on different bits of the body and have evolved accordingly. So, it is everything that you would predict from them. And so, yeah, feathered dinosaurs, not all of them, but large numbers of dinosaurs were feathered. And in part, we know that because we just got them with feathers on. It's hard to argue with that.
I mean, as a molecular biologist, of course, I would ask that question: can we extract DNA from these samples?
No. No, and no. Yeah, I mean, the half-life of DNA is something like 20,000 years. So once you get above about 500,000 years, the chance of getting any DNA is near enough nil. Someone pulled some out recently that was something like 1.1 million years old. And we're talking now again, sub-fossils and stuff that has not purely mineralized. But even that stuff, A, was far back further than we thought, but it's very, very poor quality. It's, I mean, I know you know this stuff, but, fragments of strands of DNA, the idea that we could pull out and restore an entire DNA strand, we're struggling to do that from things that are alive. Getting that out of anything that's 20,000 years old might be near enough impossible. So 65 million. Yeah, don't hold your breath. I mean, I'll say never, because God alone knows what bizarre circumstance of preservation could happen once somewhere that we might find. But you're talking billions to one against. So to all intents and purposes, just no.
Yeah, and I think that also brings to this point that fossils are important, and sometimes we just have one sample of that one fossil, and then the question comes how to study it, like whether we need to cut it or scan it, what extra.
Yeah, destructive analysis is absolutely a thing. There are certain processes that you can do to study fossils which can only come about by destroying them. Or, not the whole thing, but taking tiny samples and doing damage to it. And there's always that trade-off of, if I don't do this, I won't gain any knowledge. But if I do this, I'm actively destroying some other features. And so, oddly enough, we tend to try and focus on things that we've got a lot of. If you've got 20 or 30 specimens of something and they're all in very good condition and very complete, and they're almost replicas of each other in terms of the available data, then damaging a couple of them in a couple of small ways is really not hindering your data collection in the future and can generate some enormously valuable data. But when it's the only one that you've got, yeah, we generally don't. But of course, scanning techniques and technology is improving all the time, which makes things a bit easier. But we're still in the problem of, we talked about earlier, the fragility of fossils. A lot of things are extraordinarily fragile, and people go, well, stick it in the synchrotron in Switzerland or the diamond light source up at Oxford. It's like we can't take it. Like putting it in a car and driving it there will probably destroy it. So no, we can't even do that. It's not that simple at all.
Yeah. Then, but what extra are we doing?
Sure.
Yeah. So what extra are we doing to kind of preserve these fossils, or like, are we using like current technology, for example, with scanning, etc.?
We are where we can, but of course, scanning those kinds of things are very, very expensive to do. There's limited funding for that. There's risks associated with moving the fossil in the first place and trying to do it. For a lot of things, as I say, you don't want to take them out of climate controlled environments. A lot of things are just big. These things are built to scan. Atom smashers are not usually built to scan slabs of rock that are 6 feet square, some of which is what we have with our specimens on. We can't physically move them and just put them in front of this thing. And lots of scanning technology struggles with fossils because going back to that fossilization process, the bones, as they fossilized, have taken in chemicals from the rock in which they are buried. So they end up being usually like some kind of mineral variant of the mineral in which they're entombed. And what most scanning technology is doing, certainly things like CT and MRI scans, which we do still use, and because they're in hospitals, much cheaper, much more available, they're looking for contrast in density. And that works fine when you want to scan a human in a hospital and look at the bone under muscle and skin. But when you want to look at one type of mineral next to another type of the same mineral, they've got the same density. So there isn't any contrast. So you can't see anything. Or that density difference is pretty low. And therefore you need something very powerful and very sensitive, which medical scanners in the grand scheme of things aren't, because muscle and skin and bone and ligaments are all so different that they don't need to be. And so you can scan these things and you just get a blank page out effectively as the output. You just can't see anything. And so paleo is still in this weird world where an awful lot of what we do is what they did 250 years ago. We take photographs and we make drawings and we look at it because you can't do anything more complicated, measure it because you can't do anything more complicated than that. And that doesn't mean that it's a kind of primitive science, because we're doing some really interesting things like 3D surface scans and stuff like this. But a lot of the process of basic anatomical description, which admittedly, in medicine is still the same. When you need to, discover a new variant of a joint or ligament, you draw a picture of it to show people what it looks like. We're doing that. There's a very, very rich heritage of drawing bones in paleontology, or shells, or fossil leaves, or pollen grains, or whatever it is. It's how we document our data.
Yeah, and how an excavation site is decided, like where we can find fossils, this kind of information?
So, you need a depositional environment. It needs to have been, a riverbed or a seabed or a lake or volcanic or something like that to have buried things originally. It's very rare that you'll get fossils in rocks that are not of those kind of origins. And geologically, we mapped the world decades ago because we're looking for coal and oil and gas and, granite for countertops and, all the sandstone for houses and all the rest of it. So we know where the right types of rocks are, and we know how old they all are. And it's usually fairly easy, inverted commas, fairly easy, because, it could be in the middle of Siberia or in the middle of the Sahara, but, you're going out to a place where there are rocks of the right age that are rocks of the right type. They're probably going to have fossils in them. The only question usually is what type of fossils, how numerous are they, and how easy are they to get out? And there are trade-offs to that. So I spent a fair bit of time digging in Xinjiang province in northwest China, where fossils are very, very rare. But when you find them, they're usually entirely complete, and you often get multiple complete skeletons together. So it's a trade-off. We don't find very much, but when we do find it, it's absolutely spectacular. I've also dug in Inner Mongolia, so Chinese Mongolia, so the province to the east of that, which is just like a desert, part of the Gobi. And fossils are very, very common there. You literally every half an hour, you're finding a tooth or a leg or a couple of eggs or something like this, but complete skeletons are still really quite rare. So you'll get a lot of bits, but you won't necessarily get many skeletons. And that is a certain degree of, and of course, those are still the two best areas. There's lots of other places where you can dig for 6 weeks or prospect and look and dig for 6 weeks and come out with a tooth. Well, once we've done that, we don't go back in a hurry because it's just not worth it. And so usually now people are digging in places they're either checking out an area where no one's properly looked before in the hope that it's very good, or they're going to places where either we know the fossils that we want are very common, or the fossils we want are very important when we find them. And those are usually the criteria.
Yeah, and how big these excavation sites are? Like, you've been to many of them, right?
Yeah, I mean, it can vary enormously. I spent a couple of days in a quarry up near Oxford where it was, a hole in the ground the size of the front room that I'm sat in, and just looking around and pulled out a couple of little bits of dinosaur bone, which are really quite nice. I found some British dinosaur. But, you've got things like Dinosaur National Monument in Utah in America, which is a wall of dinosaurs. I've been to what is arguably the single biggest dinosaur quarry in the world in eastern China, in Jiucheng. It's 300 meters long by 30 meters wide, and I think we counted about 4,000 bones in it. There are everything from a hole in the ground 6 feet across to something that's nearly a quarter of a mile long. Take your pick, and certainly in Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, we've taken out 12, 16 people for 4 weeks, and every day we're just walking out and covering huge areas of land, just looking and just hoping for bits of bone poking out of the hillside. And if we find something good, we'll dig in and see what we pull out. And again, that's what they were doing in the 1850s. It hasn't changed.
Yeah, I mean, the process of extraction would be the same, right? Like
pretty much. I mean, we have power tools that they didn't have. We have some nicer technology when it comes to JCBs, or getting a Land Rover out there, or helicopters used for stuff that's really inaccessible, for example. But it's manpower or person power. It's digging a hole and with pickaxes and shovels and trowels, and making sure you don't break any bones, and covering it all in plaster of Paris and some wooden supports, just as they did in the 1800s, and physically pulling it out of the ground. And in some cases, and I've done this with a team in China, from a sand dune, you couldn't drive the cars down there. They just sank to the axle before you got anywhere near the fossil. So 10 people, a bunch of ropes, and we just physically pulled it up the hill until we got it to where it needed to be. Then we lifted it up and put it on the back of a truck and drove it out. It's, short of having a horse and cart at the end, it's no different at all to what they'd have done in 150 years ago.
Yeah, the only thing that or at least I expect might have changed is the fact that, let's say, when you get these kind of pieces now, at least you would know a bit better that, okay, which.
Oh yeah, I'm not much of an anatomist. I'm not very good at that. Again, coming from a behavior and ecology background, it's not really my field, though I've got a lot better than I was, 10, 15 years ago when I finished my PhD. But yeah, it's still, we as a whole have improved massively. And some of my colleagues who are just terrifying at this, just find broken little bits and go, it's part of the left astragalus of an alvarezsaur. How on earth do you know that? It's like, well, because it's got that feature, and that feature only turns up in this group, and this group, and then it's also got that feature, and that turns up in that group and that group. So it's got to be one of these two, and then about that size, it rules out that group. So it's got to be one of these, and it's a left because it's curved that way, not that way. And but then I guess it probably is. But Christ, I couldn't identify any of those groups, let alone tell you which features turn up in which ones on which side. But yeah, we often now, you can find a few fragments and know more or less what you've got instantly. But of course, the more exciting stuff is things that are truly new or very unusual, and then it can be really quite hard to work it out.
Yeah, since you mentioned about behavioral ecology, so how to study that?
With great difficulty, mostly, unsurprisingly, because you're looking at stuff that's been dead 60 million years. But basic comparative anatomy, stuff with sharp teeth eats meat, stuff with hard teeth usually is eating plants. I mean, that sounds a bit trite, but it's actually a very good start, and that alone tells you a lot about the ecology of animals. So things like the size of the orbit in the skull will tell you how big the eye is. That tells you how important vision is. We can look at the size and shape of the brain from the brain cavity. That will tell you how much of the brain is devoted to eyes or smell or hearing, and things like this. We can look at actually the inner ear canal and tell you if they're listening to high or low pitches. We can look at the orientation of the ear and it will tell you if they hold the head straight or pointed down. We can reconstruct muscles from skeletons, and that can give you a very good indication of how fast they are, whether or not they could accelerate well, whether or not they could reach a high top speed, how well they could turn, and you start piecing that together, coupled with things like, so I do a lot of predatory ecology, bite marks on bones, bones inside stomachs, healed injuries on herbivores that were probably inflicted by carnivores. And, you can piece an awful lot of this stuff together. There's still massive gaps. There's huge lots of things which are very uncertain. There's lots of things which are easy to overinterpret and make mistakes. But again, we've developed an awful lot through doing the same kind of comparative anatomy. And again, it's not that dissimilar to, again, kind of our gentleman Victorian scientists sitting in a room in Oxford in the 1750s, and they get sent a new lizard or a new bird from Hawaii or Australia, and they'd go, well, its head is shaped like this, so it's probably a carnivore, and it's got very strong legs, so we think it could run fast, and it could probably climb because it's got a good grip on its thumbs. It's the same stuff, actually. And again, we can test this. We can look at things like the shape of claws, how they curve and how wide they are. And I've done this, we measured hundreds of birds and lizards, and actually you can see that there's a decent correlation between the thickness and curvature of a claw and how well an animal could climb. And you can see the climbing birds and the climbing lizards from the ground birds and the ground lizards. Well, we've got dinosaur claws and we've got fossil bird claws and fossil lizard claws, so we can work out if they're climbing or not. We'll get a few wrong, there'll be a few we don't know, but roughly they'll probably fit into one of those two categories, and we can see which one it is. So yeah, we can pull a lot of that stuff out, and that's what we're doing, and that really has come on in leaps and bounds in the last few years.
Yeah, and so since we were talking about fossils, I'll just go back a bit. And so what about the eggs? Do we also find eggs as fossils?
Yeah, huge numbers of dinosaur eggs, almost like the coccolithophores. When you find them, because the conditions are right, you get thousands of them. Otherwise, they're very rare. But we do have them. We have a lot with embryos inside, so we can track them. We have nests of eggs with the adults sat on top of the eggs, which have embryos inside. So that really ties everything together very nicely. Very recently, like the last 3 years or so, we've discovered soft-shelled eggs for dinosaurs. So we thought they all had hard-shelled eggs like modern birds do, but we've now discovered a bunch of them with softer shelled eggs, more like crocodiles and lizards and tortoises and terrapins. Now that's very interesting because those preserve way, way, way less often. And so there were a bunch of dinosaur groups where we found it very odd that we'd never found eggs for them. And of course, now the obvious likelihood is that those are soft-shelled eggs. So the reason we haven't found them is their preservation is just, infinitely rarer. And now we know that actually there's a bunch of soft-shelled eggs that we found, which we probably assumed were crocodiles or turtles, because without the embryo inside, you'd assume that that's what they are, because dinosaurs don't lay those kind of eggs. Well, now we know dinosaurs do lay those kinds of eggs. So actually, we should go back and look at some of these. But yeah, in general, we have a good fossil record for dinosaur eggs, at least in part because when they did lay eggs, they were big and hard shelled, and that's a good start for making a fossil.
Yeah, but they are still in as in rocks, basically.
Yeah. I mean, hard eggshells are virtually stone anyway. They're just a ton of calcium. I mean, that's what chalk is. So they're not a million miles off already. So in that regard, yeah, they preserve very well, because again, things don't eat them. Things will break open eggs to eat the contents, and of course eggshells can shatter quite easily. But in terms of decay, if you leave an eggshell out in your garden, it will be there months later, because bacteria are not eating pure calcium, and nor is a scavenger. Once the yolk or the chick or whatever has gone from the inside, there's nothing to eat. So it'll just hang around for years until it might be buried. So yeah, you've got a very good chance of them turning up occasionally.
Interesting. And before also you mentioned one fossil where the eggs are in the stomach, because that's exciting.
Yeah, so
The
there's a an overwrap pterosaur, so a group which is actually very close to the origin of birds, and it has a pair of eggs inside it. So most dinosaurs and indeed most reptiles had paired ovaries, so actually they lay 2 eggs at a time. Sometimes these ovaries cluster up, so things like turtles, when they're laying 50 or 100 eggs at a time, that's like lots of eggs out of each ovary. But usually for animals that are laying limited numbers, they'll develop 2 at a time, 1 in each. And that's what we see in this, because there's a pair of eggs that are the same level of development. And indeed, we've got a bunch of overwrapped pterosaur nests, and the eggs are obviously laid in pairs. There's 2, then a gap, then 2, then a gap, then 2, then a gap. So that ties up very nicely. And at some point, birds went to 1. So modern birds lay 1 egg at a time. So they're doing something, they'll basically lay 1 a day. And if they're laying very large numbers, it will just take a long period of time. But dinosaurs, at least up to the origin of birds, seem to have been going down the 2 egg route. But yeah, we've got, as I say, adults sitting on nests of eggs with embryos that match the adult on them. And then we've also got individual females with pairs of eggs developing inside them. So yeah, that ties that stuff together again, unbelievably, it's inarguable.
Exactly. This is just mind-boggling stuff, and then the kind of evidence that we have, I mean, we have at least reached at that point, we can start establishing these different facts together.
Yeah.
So what are the major questions that you think we won't be able to address for when it comes to behavioral ecology of
dinosaurs? I mean, almost innumerable ones. So yeah, my new book is kind of, dealing with all of these kind of gaps and uncertainties and unknowns, and the behavior stuff is arguably the biggest one, because at least in part behavior is so incredibly plastic. Particularly social behavior. People love talking about pack hunting in dinosaurs, or pack hunting in tyrannosaurs or dromaeosaurs. And the evidence for that is extraordinarily sparse, and to my mind, not at all convincing anyway. I'm sure some did, which, and based on what evidence, is another question entirely. But, people will cite things like, well, wolves hunt in packs. Well, they do, but they often hunt alone. Hyenas, spotted hyenas hunt in these big social groups. But again, they mostly hunt alone. And the other hyenas don't hunt in groups. And lions hunt in groups, except males are often solitary, and females can be solitary. And the other cats usually are entirely solitary, except occasionally they'll team up. So yeah, this constant kind of group, entire clade X hunted in groups. And when you actually dig through the arguments, you discover that we found a group of this one species together once. And it's like, right, so they may or may not have lived in groups. Even if they did live in groups, they didn't necessarily hunt in groups. And that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about any of their other relatives at all. That is a mountain of interpretation built on an actual molehill of data, and that molehill might actually turn up to be a small hole rather than a mound. In fact, you've got everything backwards. So yeah, the social stuff is extremely complicated and uncertain, and I think it's almost impossible to resolve, because even if you had thousands of groups together of just one species, that doesn't mean they're often also operating alone. Like I say, hyenas live together and have complex social structures, but they usually hunt on their own. So it just doesn't tell you what they're doing day to day, even if you keep finding them together. So yeah, that's just a mess. I don't think it's helped by a number of people over arguing, oh, this group was social based on this species. It's like, let's stop doing that. It's not helping.
Yeah, but still fossils are important. We have a lot of information that we are getting from them. The interesting question is that how likely it is that the fossils would form. So for example, let's say if one day we have evidence of life elsewhere in the universe, Do you think, again, the fossilization can happen or would
Oh
happen?
yeah, because it's just a fundamental geological process. I mean, I'm sure there are the possibilities of life in weird planets, but ultimately you would expect there to be liquid water, because we think that's probably necessary. If you've got water and any kind of action of an atmosphere where you're going to have wind and waves, if you've got wind and waves, there is going to be rock at the core of your planet, and that's going to be eroded at times and move around and have the potential to bury things. And if it can bury things, it can make fossils. That's all that they are. They're just organic things buried in sediment. And for sediment, you need soil or rock and erosion. Well, we'd expect that to happen on most planets. So why wouldn't it happen? So yeah, I'm sure there would be. In fact, again, your extinction is forever, life is for an indeterminate period of time, so you're always actually at some level more likely to find fossils than you are living stuff. People are looking for fossils on Mars. It no longer has liquid water and can't support life, and the atmosphere is all but gone, but it might have done 1 billion years ago. Well, we're not going to find anything living, but you might find a fossil. It had erosion, it had deposition, it had moving water. I mean, I know nothing about Martian environment, but there's no reason to think that if there was life that there wouldn't be fossils there. So yeah, that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, that when we think of life, we just think that probably we'll find at least some bacteria or something.
Yeah, but yeah,
once you
fossils
start
are probably
thinking,
more likely. Yeah,
exactly. But once you start thinking from different aspects, you see that, okay, at the end, we just may find a sign which could be,
well, and even processes. So we, on Earth, we have banded iron formations, which were formed because we had an awful lot of iron in the sea. And basically, when aerobic bacteria kicked in, they produced loads and loads of oxygen, and that caused the iron to effectively rust. It oxidized, and so it precipitated. And so we can see when oxygenation first mass happened on the planet, because suddenly you get layers of iron across the entire world geologically simultaneously. There's no reason to think you couldn't trace that same process on another planet too. I mean, if it happened. But yeah, we'd expect mass production of oxygen from organic organisms, and therefore, yeah, you could trace it even without fossils, ironically.
Fascinating. Okay, and so what are the major questions in the field itself? What do you think now? Where
we could go on forever, to be honest. I think we're sort of running out of time, but that the fossil record is hilariously incomplete. We're working from fragments of skeletons, working out behavior, working out genetics, working out things like diseases is very, very tough indeed. And also, going back to the fossilization process, I said you need deposition. Some of the weirdest animals and plants out there are on islands. Hawaii, New Zealand, the Galapagos. These are volcanic. They're produced by volcanic rock, and then they just dissolve into the sea over a few million years. They're not producing fossils. So the places that might produce the most interesting and weird and unusual organisms ever don't make fossils. We're never going to find them. They simply won't exist. So there's a gap that's basically unfillable. Who knows? Just who knows?
Interesting. And how people can help in the process?
Give us money. It's a trite observation. All scientists, all academics feel that they're underfunded, but paleontology is a small branch of science. It lacks a lot of technological things like that. We don't get, unless you want to dig up oil, we don't get industry funding. There's lots of money going into DNA technologies and engineering and, chemistry and stuff like this. Paleontology, who cares if you've dug up another dinosaur? But, the general public do. But in terms of money, therefore, it's the government or bust. Those are kind of the options. Whereas, as a molecular biologist, the government might give you money, but you also might be able to go to some gene, company and go, well, we think that this technique will help you make money. Oh, well, we'll give you some research funds. Yeah, we don't have that. And simultaneously, as I say, we only find fossils where they're eroding. Not many of us are out there looking for fossils. Every fossil that is eroded is gone forever and will never exist again. You know, we worry about elephants going extinct, and we should, but elephants are breeding more elephants. If as long as we keep them breeding, there will be elephants around and we can work on elephants later. But, you know, a field of fossils erodes, they are gone. And that might be the only record of that organism which ever existed on the planet. And now it doesn't exist anymore because we didn't have the money to dig it up and put it in a museum. So we need the money. And so, yeah, so it's a trite observation. Scientist begs for money, but genuinely, that's the position paleontology is in. It is underfunded. And once our material is gone, it's gone. And that's not a great way of working on a subject. So, yeah, we could do with a couple more quid.
Yeah, and how do they can support, basically, like how they can fund?
Well, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that people should open a check and pay me, but you know, there are funds and sponsorships that people could pay into. You know, visit museums, give museums money, buy stuff from their gift shops. You know, write to museums and members of parliament or politicians and point out that this is valuable and needs to be funded and supported. Various museums do fundraisers, various universities do fundraisers, some individuals. I did one years ago. I did a Kickstarter for a research project. I was a broke person in between doing my PhD and having a permanent job. I had an opportunity to do a bit of research and I didn't have any ready cash or any government sponsorship. And I asked around and lots of people gave me $10 and $20 and I could afford the flight to Canada to do the study. Things like that are out there too. So look around and help out and, you know, kick in $10 and it might make a difference to someone's research.
That's great. I think this is probably the best time to summarize the session also, because now we have given a lot of information on dinosaurs, but a lot of information of how people can support science on paleontology or on dinosaurs. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And
no, thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.